Nurses are often the first to comfort us when we're at our weakest, when the machines beep steadily in a hospital room, when family members step outside to cry, or when the uncertainty of recovery lingers thick in the air. They carry hope in their pockets and reassurance in their voices. But not all who wear white are angels. This is the disturbing story of a nurse who didn't help people get better, but quietly, methodically, facilitated their deaths. Before we dive into the story, please subscribe to our channel for more crime documentaries. Thank you. Now, the story. His name was Niels Högel. Blonde hair, clean uniform. A soft voice that rarely rose above a murmur. He was the kind of man who could slip into a room unnoticed, and yet somehow always be there when it mattered most. Patients felt safer with him around. Families nodded with relief when they saw his face. And fellow nurses? They called him dependable, efficient, the kind of colleague who'd stay behind after his shift to help clean a bedpan without being asked. At St. Johan's Hospital in the German city of Oldenburg, Högel was known as a hard worker, a man you could count on. The kind who never said no to an extra shift, who handled even the most delicate machinery with calm precision. Colleagues trusted him. Doctors liked him. He blended in easily like furniture in a familiar room. But behind the sterile white walls of the hospital, in corridors lined with trust and routine, something was beginning to rot. It started slowly, almost invisibly. A life lost here. A sudden cardiac arrest there. Tragic, of course, but this was the ICU death came with the job. Patients arrived in critical condition, some barely clinging to life. A few made it out. Many didn't. That was the accepted rhythm. But not all deaths are equal. And not all were inevitable. What nobody knew then was that Niels Högel had already begun experimenting. He wasn't overwhelmed or burnt out. He wasn't coping poorly with grief. He wasn't a mercy killer, trying to end suffering. No, Niels Högel was chasing adrenaline. He was playing God. He'd inject patients with a precise dose of adrenaline, or lidocaine, or other heart-impacting medications. Drugs meant to treat, but misused, they could stop the heart in an instant. The patient's vital signs would crash. Nurses would scramble, alarms would blare, and Högel would be the first to respond. He thrived in chaos. Sometimes he revived them, pounding their chest like a hero in a medical drama. Other times the flatline never reversed. The patient died. Either way, he got what he wanted. In his twisted logic, a successful resuscitation made him look like a savior, and when the patient died, well, death wasn't unusual in this wing of the hospital. No one would suspect. No one would know. The thrill of almost being caught became part of the ritual. In 2002, Högel was transferred to Delmenhorst Hospital, about an hour's drive from Oldenburg. No warnings were issued, no red flags raised. There was no scandal. No paperwork marked concern. To Delmenhorst, he arrived clean, as though he had simply outgrown his old position and was ready for new challenges. He entered quietly like always, the kind of hire no one questioned. And the ICU, it became his playground. This time the game escalated. He stopped second-guessing himself. There was no hesitation in his hand as he prepped the syringe. No racing pulse when the machines began to scream. He had learned the signs, how to walk into a room just before the crash. How to call for help just late enough to make the outcome feel inevitable. And it worked, for a while. Delmenhorst had its share of chaos. Night shifts were busy. The patient list never stopped rotating. And no one looked too closely when a life slipped away unexpectedly. It was tragic, of course, but death always had a reason in the ICU: cardiac arrest, sepsis, stroke. The margins were thin. The excuses were plenty. But over time, a whisper started to move through the ward. Something didn't feel right. Nurses began to notice patterns. Patients who were stable just hours earlier were suddenly coding without warning. There were too many unexpected cardiac arrests. Too many crashes after visiting hours. Too many deaths on Högel's shift. Some staff began to keep notes quietly. They compared rosters. Charted incidents. A young nurse, barely 2 years into her job, even created a crude calendar behind a locker door. It wasn't official, it wasn't scientific, but it showed a disturbing trend. On nights when Niels Högel worked, things went wrong more often. Still, there were no confrontations, no bold accusations. In the medical world, especially in a country as procedural as Germany, suspicion isn't enough. Doubt doesn't count as evidence. And Niels? He wore their silence like armor. He continued injecting, continued watching, continued calling the code. Sometimes he saved them. More often, he didn't. And still, no one asked the question aloud. Until one day, a patient who had been talking with his wife just that morning, eating, laughing, asking about his grandchildren, was found dead by evening. No cause, no explanation, no warning. He had coded minutes after Högel walked into the room. That death was hard to dismiss. And then there was the woman with a broken leg. She wasn't even critically ill. She was supposed to be transferred out of I.C.U. that morning. Instead, she died before lunch. Her vitals had been fine. Her labs, unremarkable. Again, Högel was there. It all came to a head in June 2005, when a senior doctor caught him near a patient's pump just seconds before the man flatlined. Högel had been standing there alone. The crash came fast. And this time, the doctor didn't shrug it off. That night, the hospital made a quiet call to the police. But they didn't yet know what they had just uncovered. They thought it might be negligence or, at worst, a rogue nurse with 2 or 3 suspicious cases tied to his name. They didn't realize they were staring at the deadliest serial killer in Germany's post-war history, and Niels Högel. He hadn't even begun to confess. When the police first brought in Niels Högel for questioning in 2005, they still believed they were dealing with a single incident. Maybe 2. A nurse making reckless decisions under stress, a lapse in judgment, not murder. Högel sat calmly across the table, not defensive, not nervous. Just calm, and then he confessed. Not to everything. Not yet, but to that one injection. The one that had triggered the arrest. He admitted that yes, he had administered adrenaline to the patient moments before the crash. He said he wanted to test himself, to feel the rush of saving a life, but it had gone wrong. The investigators leaned in. There was more to this, they could feel it. He was arrested, charged with attempted murder, and quietly put behind bars. But even in prison, Högel didn't talk much. He gave just enough for prosecutors to build their case. No more. Back at the hospital, the administration launched a deeper audit. They didn't speak to the press, no press releases, no press conferences. They combed through years of patient records behind closed doors. Matching names, comparing dates, looking for irregularities. And slowly an awful pattern began to surface. Patients, dozens of them, had all died during Högel's shifts. People who should have survived or at least had a chance. Many of the deaths had looked natural, sudden, unpreventable. But in hindsight, too many of them defied logic. Too many were inexplicable. The Delmenhorst I.C.U. turned cold. Nurses stopped smiling. The ones who'd once worked beside Högel with admiration now felt physically sick. Some had unknowingly handed him syringes. Others had assisted in resuscitations they didn't realize he had staged. A few even remembered joking with him after a patient died, telling him he'd done his best. Now, they were questioning everything. How many people had they watched him kill? How many times had he smiled after? As the internal investigation deepened, authorities began quietly exhuming bodies. Autopsies were ordered. Lab tests run. And the results were damning. In case after case, traces of drugs like adrenaline, sotalol, and lidocaine medications that had not been prescribed were found in the tissue. There was no medical reason for these drugs to be present, and yet they were, again and again, patient after patient. The scale was staggering. Oldenburg, where Högel had worked before, also launched its own audit. That's when they uncovered that the deaths hadn't started in Delmenhorst. They had followed him there. He had been killing for years. By 2008, Högel had been convicted of multiple counts of attempted murder and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. But something didn't sit right with investigators. The body count was too low, the timeline too short. The truth had to be bigger. Then, in 2014, he made a second, more disturbing confession. He admitted he hadn't just tried to kill a few patients. He had done it, dozens of times. In a series of interviews with a psychologist and a new team of investigators, Högel revealed that his first time had been in Oldenburg, back in 2000. He had injected a patient, watched the heart monitor crash, and rushed in for the save. It was exhilarating. That moment had changed him. He spoke in calm, almost clinical tones, describing how he'd choose his targets, those with a chance of survival but not too strong. He needed the situation to look plausible. Too healthy, and it would raise questions. Too sick, and no one would be surprised. He walked a tightrope, and he loved it. He described how he kept syringes hidden under his sleeve, how he learned to avoid security cameras, How he'd time the injection perfectly, then step back, wait for the monitor to scream, and leap into action. Sometimes he saved them. Sometimes he didn't. But each time he got what he wanted: a stage, applause, respect,